Sounds good.
And it looks like we're going. Go ahead for it.
Okay, welcome. Welcome to this portion of the meetup. It was nice to meet you all. This is me. I'm Joyce. I'm developer relations over at Postman. This is my dog, Lucy, who I picked an unfortunate time to join you guys because we're right on the cusp of dinner time, and I thought feeding her a little bit early would have sated her appetite, but no, I think it just made her hungry. So that's Lucy. So this section, I'm just going to go over a brief introduction. I will spend a little bit more time explaining what Postman is. It sounds like some folks are new. And the talk was, I think, called Overview of Postman. So I will go over the basics of what is documentation in Postman. And then depending on what people think, and feel free to ask questions all throughout, I do have part 3, which is kind of advanced Postman use cases, some cool things that I've seen, productivity things, security checks, that kind of thing. But if your brain's melting by the time we get to section 3, we'll just go Q&A. We'll just go straight to Q&A. So that's what I have planned for you there. So hello from Postman. This is what Postman looks like. You might have seen it or at least seen screenshots of it, maybe in other people's documentation. And today we have 12 million people using Postman in one manner or another. So this is the one architectural diagram or like diagrammy slide I have for you, but there's 2 API life cycles, and I would say the vast majority of people spend it on the left side. So hopefully you can see my neon green pointer. This is the API consumer lifecycle that I bet everyone on the call here is curious about using Postman for this or has used Postman for this, but they're basically spending time in this part of the donut. They're learning about an API, they're experimenting with it, poking at it, seeing what's going to happen. So they're probably doing these 3 things. So they're learning, authenticating, and then sending a request. This is the API client exploration part of the donut. And most of the people spend time in the API consumer lifecycle, but today we're actually going to hop over to the API producer lifecycle, the orange donut on the right. So if you have an API, internal private API or public API or partner APIs, whatever type of API, there's a producer lifecycle. And specifically when you're talking about defining your specification, I heard some people talking about using API specs, debugging, testing, documenting and publishing are the 2 pieces of the orange donut that we're going to focus on today. So lots of different ways to pop in and pop out. Most people, if you've never heard of Postman, most people you've heard use cases probably here in this part of the consumer lifecycle. But today we're going to talk about official documentation and also publishing your documentation. Okay. So let me go ahead and let me look at my notes. Okay, so Postman has an annual survey. We ask people every year some questions. And one of the questions that we asked last year, I think it was December of last year, is when the last 2019, we had our survey published. We asked people to rate their documentation. So in your minds, rate your own documentation. It can be API documentation. It can be your tech documentation. I know I'm very critical of the Postman documentation, but rate your own documentation. What would you say? On a scale of 1 to 5, is it above average? Is it below average? Is it just about right? Just in your mind, do that exercise. So rate your documentation. What we found was people, overwhelmingly, the majority, are saying our documentation is not well documented. It's below average. So this is actually not surprising. It's hard to keep documentation up to date, accurate, relevant. And so people are very, very critical. Another question we asked them was, how can you improve your documentation? What would make your documentation better? And you can see that better examples, standardization, that's kind of the API spec goal, sample code, real world use cases, and yada, yada. So there's a lot of things that people know what can be done for their documentation, and they tend to look at their own documentation rather critically. Okay, so I'm going to use that shortcut now, the one that I learned earlier, not the one that I just learned. So I'm going to scooch over to Postman. Okay, so hopefully you can see Postman up on the screen. And if you want to follow along, for some people that do know Postman, if you have Postman open, right now, you can go ahead and pull in this example collection, and then you can take a look at it a little bit closer, a little bit more inspection going on. So I have this collection called Working with GraphQL. If you go to the New button and tab over to Templates and search for GraphQL, it's this one right here. You can pull it in and inspect it a little bit closer. Otherwise, I'm zoomed in pretty aggressively, so hopefully you can see what's going on. If there's any visibility or I'm not clear, please do go ahead and drop it in the chat. And Liz, I told you I could keep an eye on the chat, but I literally don't know where it is on my interface right now. So if you can keep an eye on the chat, please let me know.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, so this is a baby collection of 4 requests. And if you don't work with GraphQL, don't worry about it. Postman is an HTTP client. So REST, SOAP, GraphQL, all that kind of stuff. It looks fairly the same. Let me go ahead and pull up one of these requests. So this is 4 requests grouped together in a folder or a collection in Postman terminology. And right away I see the method, the URL location, and all this metadata. So in this case, we might have headers, we might have a body we're submitting, and all this metadata is here in the graphical user interface. So it's very much like curl, except in a graphical user interface. Although don't tell the marketing people I said that, because that's not our official tagline. So it's a way to make your API calls. And again, if you think about the API consumer lifecycle, I can sit here and I can update my query. I can update these parameters and then hit send and then inspect what I get back. So that's here on the bottom. In this case, I'm making a GraphQL query to Spotify Heroku app, and I'm searching for Pearl Jam albums, returning the album names. So a lot of people are familiar with this metadata portion of Postman. There's also official documentation. So in this case, if I expand this request name, I can add metadata about this specific request. So here I'm using Markdown. I'm describing the request. You can actually describe the request. You can describe the entire collection, folders. If you have parameters, you can add Markdown to hyperlink to here's where you get this element. Okay, so this is still not the official documentation feature in Postman, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like in Postman before we move to the documentation feature. So this is metadata that I've added here. If I have a body, if I have a header, say I need to add X API key or something like that, I can go ahead and add placeholder values. So I'm just pseudocoding here. This hopefully you're not using X API headers, because that's, I think, frowned upon. And I can go ahead and add, in this case, this double curly braces syntax is a variable. So I'm just, it's a templating. I'm templating an API key variable, and this is where you can add get this key here. So you can go ahead and add your, you guys don't need to watch me write Markdown, but you get the idea. This would be Markdown describing this parameter. So environments are, or rather variables, are something that a lot of people don't know about in Postman. And when you use them for documentation purposes, you can actually use it to string substitute in placeholder values. So if you're explaining to your users how to do authentication, you can plug in friendly variables like API key. You can go ahead, if you have a sandbox environment, you can go ahead and plug in sandbox credentials. So this, what I mean by string substitution, is in the render documentation, which again, we haven't seen yet, you'll actually plug in what this value is. So I'm gonna go ahead and X out of this just in case, well, this will mess up my request here. Okay, so any questions about just the basic API client, Postman as an API client?
Joyce, we do have a request to slow down.
Oh yeah. Is it my talking or is it my describing things? Because I do talk fast.
I think for some it's the former and for some it's the latter. I think there might be, you know, based on our just show of hands earlier, there may be plenty of folks who are lacking context for what you're even showing. And then there may be a verbally a request to slow down.
Okay. I do talk rather fast, so I thought about having another serving of coffee this evening, but I'm glad I didn't. So also, people that have used Postman before, feel free to chime in on the chat and explain how you use it. I think some people already did, but what I'm doing here is in the top half of the page. This is where I'm fiddling with the API call. I'm building my request. And in the bottom, after I hit send, I've made a call to the Spotify server. Rather, it's not Spotify server, it's a Heroku server, or an app hosted on Heroku. And this is what the server is bringing back to me. So the classic case of people using Postman is to make your API calls, send them off, and then inspect what's going on down here. So in this case, if I wanted to make a query about what are the album names by the artist, in this case, I'm saying Pearl Jam, then I can go ahead and inspect the response. Maybe I want to write some code and drill down into the albums, this array, and then pull out, parse the response and pull out the first, what's gigaton? I don't know Pearl Jam. I should not have used that as an example. But if I'm here and I'm like, what's another musical artist?
The Spice Girls.
Spice Girls. Okay, I hope this is all appropriate, but I'm gonna go ahead and hit send. And now in the bottom, this Heroku app has returned Spice Girls, Forever, classics like Spice World, Spice, and Club remixes. Okay, so that's the general use case. It's an API client. You're tweaking the request, sending it off to the server, and then inspecting the response. Mm-hmm. Okay, so one thing I already talked about was environments. So environments are one scope of variable that there is in Postman. So like in programming, you have global scopes, you have environment, you have maybe collection level scopes. The collection is this request, or this collection of 4 requests here. You have local variables, data variables, lots of different types of variables. And in this case, I'm creating an environment that contains key value pairs that I can then publish my documentation with. So for example, if I have a sandbox environment and I want to marry up the collection with the environment that I publish publicly, then anyone that interacts with my endpoints in Postman can now retrieve that sandbox data. And that's actually a better practice. I don't know how many people have sandboxes, but it makes it really easy to see what type of information they're getting back without any security risk. Okay, so a couple more things I wanted to point out just in this friendly interface, or not friendly interface, because maybe this is a little overwhelming if this is the first time you've seen it, but a lot of people spend day in and day out here just sending off a request, doing their work, sending off a request, doing their work. So once you have your request working the way you want, if you click this code button here, this code generator button, you can go ahead and copy, say you're making, you're working with SDKs for different languages, you can go ahead and copy and paste this code that emulates that API call in whatever language you want. So being able to recreate what you're doing in Postman in code is what that link is. And again, we're in Postman, we still haven't seen the official documentation feature, but that type of code generation you'll see echoed in a slightly different way in the web documentation. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to show you here for exactly the same reason is I've already hit this Heroku app. And in fact, you'll look under authorization, it's open. You can hit this with a curl request. You don't need any kind of access credentials. It's an open API, not like Open API version 3, but it's a public API that does not require any authorization. So this doesn't matter, but what if you need authorization header? What if you need an access token? If I save this response that I get back from the server, if I go ahead and save that response here, I can save it as an example. And once I do, I actually go up here. It's a little bit subtle in the UI, but you can see a badge here. There's one example saved, and this is the request metadata and also the response metadata. displaying this type of information in the documentation is very important, because if somebody isn't doing something right, they're stuck on auth, or they're just kicking the tires for this API, they don't know what the API is for. They don't know what the endpoint is for. Saving this type of paired request and response example demonstrates a lot clearer than telling them with words. So those are examples. Okay, I'm about to move on. So if there's any questions, Liz, let me know.
There was a question about the authorization tab, but I think because the question was they wanted to see that Postman can do authenticated API calls. But I think what you just showed, I think what you were saying was once you've saved it as an example, then you could use it with the authorization tab.
So once you save an example, you're just displaying an example, but somebody else, yeah, using it in the documentation. But for authorization, so depending on how you authorize your requests, you might have to, like, for example, add an authorization header, and maybe you have like a bearer token with like token or something like that, or however you do maybe you include an API key. However you handle that, you can go ahead and build here in the metadata, or sorry, in the UI. Or if you're like, say this is 4 requests, I don't want to have to add a header every single time. Say you have 200 requests and it's just API reference and you just want to document the whole thing. There is this authorization tab that allows you to, for example, say it's OAuth 2.0, and then this whole thing here, oh gosh, does anybody do OAuth 2.0? I recently had to dig down deep into it. Look at all the pieces of it, you know, depending on what flavor of auth you're doing. So once you enter in all your credentials, though, what Postman will do, you have to do this once, then Postman will generate that access token based on your credentials and then stuff it into the request that you're making.
Nice. And then that gets used in all the calls that you make.
Yeah, so there's inheritance. So in this case, right now, I'm at the request level and I'm saying use OAuth 2.0. Or I can say inherit auth from the parent, and the parent would be the folder, and then the parent of the folder would be the collection. So if it's the same authorization method for all 200 requests in your collection, you can set it at the collection level, and that'll cascade down to all the children. You have to be careful, though. For documentation, authorization is treated differently in Postman. I wanted to save that for one of the advanced topics, but this authorization tab is super helpful for onboarding. You can get people started so much faster, but it's a little slippery, right? It's so easy. Now, how do they do it for real on their own apps? So using something like this under headers is very explicit. It's the same thing with programming. Trade-off between like, oh, it's so clever, it works, versus explicitly explaining to somebody how to auth your technology. Okay. So that's just API client, a few little touches here that are foreshadowing for what documentation in Postman's gonna look like. So now if I'm working, so all of this stuff, I'm about to move over to a collaborative feature. So this is, you know, the canonical use case, the API client, people use it, it's a free feature. There is a rate limited collaboration feature. So if I have 4 requests and I'm sharing with 100 people, that's fine, but there is a limit of 25 requests. So if people are not on a team plan, then you can ignore this next blurb that I'm about to tell you. But say I'm done with this collection. I've tinkered around with it. I've added all this markdown. I've described what I want people to do with it. How do I share it with my team members? Say this is private documentation. This is a workflow that I want to have all new engineers go through, let's say. So if you click this flyout, you can see a bunch of stuff that I can do with this collection. And I want to share it. So I'm going to go to that orange button. And I can share it with another workspace, with another team. So maybe I'm sharing it with technical writers team. Maybe I'm sharing it with QA. Whoever you want to share it with, you can go ahead and share it there and then continue. In this case, I'm going to leave it here because I'm in a team workspace and I've invited anybody that I want to collaborate with me. But once it's in this team workspace, you can see that I'm in a team workspace. And I have one coworker here that is helping me out on this documentation. I can come here and I can say manage roles. So I'm the original author of this collection, but now I want to pull in my coworker, and the default permission is view only. And in fact, he's deleted some of my stuff before, so I'm going to leave him as view only. But if I trusted him to help me out on some of the documentation or updating the endpoints, I would grant him editor access. Okay, so that's just how you work with a team. And in fact, a lot of people are on the team plan. They just don't, they're still like emailing each other JSON files and stuff like that. So this is just a slightly easier, more smooth way to work like that. Okay, so another way to share, and this deals directly with documentation. So that was the paid feature. It's rate limited. Now we're back to the free stuff. So here, if I wanted to share again, remember last time we could have shared to a team workspace. This button here is so powerful, and when people discover it, it's really, it does a lot, but it's kind of embedded here. Oh, I didn't mean to say the word embed, but it's kind of hidden here. So when I come here and I hit share, this is the only time that I would have seen it. But this little button here is called the Run in Postman button. You might have seen it in documentation. You might have documentation where you've embedded it in a tutorial or something like that. When I click generate code, Postman generates two different types of buttons. If you're doing the README in a GitHub repo, you can go ahead and slap this markdown, copy and paste, and put it in there. And Postman has like bundled up this collection into this URL. And it looks like this. On the README page, it would look like this. But when somebody clicks it, then they're able to pull that collection in. And in fact, I had a collection, but remember, I had an environment. So now I've bundled together the collection and the environment behind this little button. And now I can drop it into a blog post, into my documentation, into my web portal, or whatever. So that's the Run in Postman button. It's pretty rad.
It's very cool.
Any questions? I want to make sure I'm not going too fast because I almost guarantee nobody's heard of the Run in Postman button.
That's really cool. I wonder if maybe after you've finished what you're prepared here, you could show an example of Run in Postman in, like, you know, somebody's docs or somebody's blog post or some third party something.
Oh yeah, I have a short list of very good documentation that I think people have done a good job with. And I point people there because they took the time to figure out what's the best way I can tell my users how to work with the endpoints using Postman. So I do have some very nice examples.
That would be great to see.
Okay, so this is, I'm about to leave Postman, the app. Don't worry, we'll come back. But I'm about to show you actual documentation. So if there's any questions, let me know before I leave.
We do have a couple more questions in the chat.
Yeah.
One is, from Joe, he asks, can you associate variables with collections instead of environments?
That's a good question. So I showed you an environment variable, but remember there's a ton of different scopes of variables. So you can actually go to the three dots here, and when you hit edit, you can define a collection level variable so that you don't have to marry a collection with an environment. It's just associated with the collection. And just like with authorization, remember we said it's a trade-off between making it super easy to get started and being explicit. A collection level variable, even though it's very convenient and it's one entity, a collection, variable associated with that collection, it's a little bit less explicit because the user has to go to the three dots, they have to go to edit, and they have to go to variables to see it. Okay, so it's a little bit of a trade-off between slickety slide, ooh, I got that API working, and how do I get it working in my own app? Any other questions?
Yeah, I'll do another. Oh, go ahead. You can do it, Liz. You're fine, Liz.
This one's from Jatin. If the API call is authenticated, do you need to have a public API key in order to embed the button?
If the API
call is authenticated?
Yeah, is authenticated, do you need an API key behind the button?
Public API key.
Yeah, so yes. So what the button will do, let me show you, like, I'm just showing you a picture of the button, not what it actually does. what the button will do is embed that collection and allow us to pull that collection into their own instance of Postman. So if you bundle it with an environment that contains those access tokens, which unless it's a sandbox environment credentials, like I wouldn't ever do that, right? They will need to go retrieve their own credentials. And that's what I was saying a little bit earlier about placeholder text. Now, if I have an environment or a collection variable and I say API key, like you should put placeholder text in here because of the way Postman will render it. So instead of just leaving a blank spot and expecting them to plug in their own credentials, put your API key because in the render documentation, it's going to display this. This is confusing in a lot of documentation. I've been consuming a lot of documentation lately, and some people will put double curly braces. Sometimes they'll do angle brackets. Sometimes they'll just code format it. And I think that's one of the confusing things as somebody who's new to your tech. It's like, okay, am I supposed to put my thing there? Now, am I supposed to put angle brackets? Am I supposed to include the curly braces? And that's a little confusing for people. So in this case, it's going to render the words, your dash API dash key. All right, so let's go on to actual Postman documentation. So this is interesting, and I wanted you to have this background so you understand what Postman is and how somebody's going to be consuming your documentation on the tail end in that blue learner's donut. But now you're an API publisher and you want to actually publish web documentation. So let's go back to this flyout. Remember, this is where we shared the collection earlier. And now we're going to hit view in web. Okay. And this other window opened up here. So let me drag it over. Y'all see this? I don't know why I'm asking you. It's probably the same window that's being shared. Okay. So I'm here in Chrome and I am logged in. This is my avatar. I'm logged in. This is my private view. So if I'm on my Postman team and somebody else comes to this team workspace, they can view this documentation. This is the web render documentation. So let's go to that same request we were working on earlier, which I think I left some junk in there, so please forgive my junk. So this is the metadata. Here's the method, URL location. This is the markdown that I added. In fact, I actually added a screenshot. I added a code block of the GraphQL schema. And then here's the rendered body, the query that was in our body tab, GraphQL variables. This is all the metadata that we were playing around with in that Postman collection. This is what the auto-generated documentation looks like. And in fact, if I got those requests working, but I never took the time to add Markdown, it would still be pretty consumable. It's something that somebody else could plug in their own credentials if needed and play around with and consume. I think this is what the API is supposed to be doing. And then remember, we took a look at that code generation button. So let me scroll to the top real quick. So that code generation button in Postman has its counterpart in the web documentation. So I think we are working in Node request framework. Now let's go back to that request. This is that front end call, that API call replicated in code. So somebody consuming the documentation can do the same thing that they could in Postman. And these are those examples that we saved earlier. So I'm not even in Postman interacting with your server, but I get a sense, okay, this is what the endpoint will give me. Okay, so this is really anticlimactic after we spent all that time in the Postman app. But let me see if there's anything else that I had on my list. Okay, so this is the private documentation. And let's go ahead and publish this documentation. So private is private. People on your Postman team can see. Oh, Geraldine, is your hand raised? How come I can't see the chat?
I think when you're presenting, maybe it uses all the real estate.
Got it.
I think you have to like go down into the little menu that gets hidden when you're presenting, and you have to mouse over it and it comes up, and then you get the three-dot menu, and then you choose chat, and then you
Thank you. Oh my gosh.
I don't know why they hide it.
Can you guys see my chat? Because I can't drag it over to the other. I'm just moving my mouse errantly. Okay, I finally get to see everyone talking. Okay, so let me know if there's anything that I missed because it's covering part of my screen right now.
There's a couple of questions. They mostly take place back in Postman, but one is, it looks like Run in Postman, the button called Run in Postman, hits a Postman server. The question is, how does it access my servers? My servers.
So it hits the Postman servers because Postman is saving the collection. The collection is whatever you save to it. So if you had a Heroku app on there, if you had your production URL, if you had a staging URL, it would be hitting whatever you're pointing the collection calls to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
The next question was, can a Postman variable override a property in the collection, such as an OAS3 URL? In other words, he'd like to override the value of a URL with a test URL.
So I'm not so familiar with OAS3 URL, that variable syntax, but the way Postman variables work is that variables resolve in a scope of narrowing scope. That's terrible. I shouldn't have used the word scope twice. But you have text, literally what it is. If you surround it in curly braces, Postman will try to plug in a variable. So there is some wizardry that you can do with double curly braces that just boil down to string substitution. So you can double nest double curly braces variables to achieve what you want. Although, again, that's terrible for your user and please don't do it.
Well, I think it might be worth noting too that if I understand correctly, these collections aren't actually reading from your OpenAPI spec. You're actually building the collection and saying, here's a call, here's the endpoint you'll hit with the call. You build that collection. It's not just like going, oh, I'm just gonna create a collection based on the stuff in your OpenAPI like file.
Yeah, so that's a good...
You can do, the thing is that you can do that. You can import collections. You can import OAS3 specs into a collection. And it's handy for, the question that I asked is, it's handy for testing because my OAS3 spec will have the production server in it. But I don't want to hit the production server because it doesn't suit the purposes for testing. I want to be able to hit a test instance, a test URL. That's why I asked the question. But we can take this to the end. This is a very specific usage.
Please remind me at the end because I'm not even talking about APIs today. I decided not to talk about the open API schemas, pulling that in, generating collections from it. So please remember to ask that.
But already I can see the value of being able to generate documentation using Postman. It's cool. Okay.
Do you want to actually see the actual documentation yet? We're still in the private documentation, guys.
Go
I feel
for
like
it.
I feel like I'm overpromising this, but it's very exciting as we have talked so much and yet we haven't seen the documentation. So this is okay. It's still documentation. It's private documentation amongst my team. But if I have a public, oops. So I just clicked on this and opened the inline editor. You can also not add markdown and you can go ahead and do inline editing here in the web. But if I have public documentation, I want to share it publicly. So once I publish it, it's going to be available publicly. Anyone can hit this and see it and view it and consume it. So this is only for people with public APIs. I click that publish button in the top right. And now I can go ahead and I only have one version because this is an example. But if I were to slowly roll out changes, I would definitely want to know what version am I publishing. In this case, sure, let's go ahead and grab that GraphQL environment, but this could be, again, Sandbox, right, to plug in those credentials. If I have a custom domain, I can go ahead and plug it there. Some theming, if you guys know some hex colors, I'll plug this in and we can style this beautifully. Otherwise, we're going to leave it Postman colors. Okay, so, and then on the way to publishing, this is auto toggled on, but this is the discovery portion. You might have missed it in our API consumer donut, but how do you discover new APIs? So in this case, this is not API reference. This is for requests that are walking through a workflow that I am defining, but it's not like I own Spotify Heroku API. So I'm gonna click add to Postman templates and I'm gonna go ahead and publish as me. This is my user profile and this is, I should actually add this because this gives me reputation. People don't know what's going on. But imagine that you had a public API, like Stripe has a public API. Imagine Stripe is here and they want to add it to the API network. You would want to make sure that you publish it under your team profile. And in this case, I have my logo plugged in here. I have my bio. And then here's some metadata. This description is different. So we're under this section called API Network. This is different than any description that you added earlier associated with the collection, with the requests, any of that markdown. And then here's some tags for discovery. What are my relevant, so this is working with GraphQL. So probably like development, music, do you see entertainment? Okay, so those are the relevant tags for me, and I can go ahead and publish this collection. So I see these toasts here. I've added it to the API network. My collection is published, and I can go to this link here. This is the Postman API network. So we're actually talking about like a directory of public APIs, and this is that metadata that I added earlier. And if I want to view documentation, at long last, we have seen Postman generated documentation, and finally, okay? So it looks very similar to the private documentation. Remember when we were logged in and you saw your avatar, but in this case, it's public. It's swapping in our logo, our Postman colors that we left in, and we still have all the stuff that we use, the code snippets, all that information. It's just styled slightly differently. Okay, so that's, again, anticlimactic because we've already seen behind the scenes what all this is. And if your eye is keen, you'll see this little orange Run in Postman button. So when you publish documentation, this is affixed here. You can go ahead and drop that into a blog post standalone, but it just comes automatically affixed at the top here. So what happens now? Say you created a standalone Run in Postman button and you dropped it into your README or a blog post or whatever. So this would be probably in the center of your page, and you would go ahead and click it. And I have, remember everyone knows, I'm embarrassed. Everyone knows I'm on a Windows machine and I have Postman installed. So it's prompting me to download, pull it into Windows. And then it's also prompting me to pull it into the web. So just because I already have the collection here in my instance of the Windows Postman, I'm gonna go ahead and bring this into this workspace. And now I'm in the web, I'm still in Chrome. This launched relatively recently, Postman in the web. So it just, you probably didn't even notice, but it's just Postman in the web. And here's that collection that I'm bringing in. So now I can start tinkering and exploring with Postman the way we were. So we've come full circle. We started creating our documentation in Postman, we published it to the web, and then from the web, we can like browse this stuff, hit Run in Postman, and we've pulled it back into Postman to interact with it. So I talked about some new things, but if you're new to Postman, then everything's new. So are there any questions about official documentation?
Can I ask a clarifying question, Joyce? So I think you were talking about a couple of different users. The first one, the user that you were emulating was like the person who's designing the API or designing the endpoint or testing it. And then you were a user who was inside your team, like collaborating on documentation. And then the third one was you're the user who's consuming that documentation that's been published. Something like that?
Correct. So there's many different ways you can interact with Postman, and you can interact with it as an API producer, as an API producer collaborator, and then also as an API consumer. That's a good way to phrase it.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat, which is from B. Why did you decide to use GraphQL for this demo instead of REST? I think, you know, at least those of us who've worked with API documentation or APIs, they're mostly RESTful. So, but you've got a GraphQL example here. So that's what B's question is about.
B, I had no reason for picking a GraphQL example. I was just thinking same. But if I go back to this instance of Postman, I have, I'm going to go ahead and collapse this and clean this up a little bit. I have a REST example here. So we can see actually how it's different and how it's not. So in this case, this is a GET request to Postman Echo. It's a service that echoes back what you send it. And I have some query string parameters. My body, well, let me see a different one because we saw one with a post. This is what my body looks like. It's just raw text. It's basically the same thing, and it feels the same in Postman, except for some weird looking query syntax. Any other questions?
So the process
like
you would go through in designing and testing, in collaborating and publishing, in the audience consuming and trying it out is the same for RESTful as it is for GraphQL?
It is the same for, yeah. So everything is pretty much the same. Somebody was talking about APIs, which is not APIs, API specifications, which is kind of like a meaty topic. I wasn't planning on showing this, but if we scooch over from collections over to APIs, you can go ahead and bring in a new API schema. So I think, was it Joe? Somebody was saying that they go ahead and import like an open API file here. That's an ad hoc import. It's a one-time import. It never talks with your open API file again. It's just a one-time pull-in. There's also this tab here where if I go ahead and select that file, oh shoot, I have some examples here. That was luck, total luck. So if I go ahead and select this file, I believe it's YAML, so I think it's the open API one I have. I'm going to call this auth. I'm going to call this version 1. I'm going to go ahead and create an API. Close this. So behind the scenes, this is what this like weird looking thing is, an open API version 3 specification. And somebody was asking about REST versus GraphQL. Postman also allows you to pull in a GraphQL schema. And then, actually I might have, okay, I don't want to get down this rabbit hole of API specifications, but once you import this specification file, and Joe, you might want to look into this, you can actually connect, if you're using GitHub, you can connect a source control so that if somebody's futzing with GitHub in the GitHub specification file, it'll sync with Postman.
That's so cool.
And then from here, like, I mean, you could sit here and author it and design everything in here if you wanted to, but you can generate a collection. And that's what I think, Joe, again, you were the one that was saying, I can go ahead and generate a collection from that open API specification file. And depending on if you're using version 2 or version 3, it's a little bit subjective. So the conversion might not end up exactly how you want, because people have been saying, I want annotations to look like this, or the folder structure to look like that. And then somebody else says something different. So you might have to fiddle with it, but you can go ahead and convert that to a collection.
So when you connect it to your open API spec file in your repo, that's not a one-time import, that's an ongoing relationship.
It's a one-time import when you first import it in. If you connect the repository, then it's a two-way sync.
Oh, so it round trips if you make changes here, like in this view that you're showing, having connected the repository, it would round trip into your repo?
Correct, two-way.
That is so cool.
Yeah. And currently I think it's just, oops, it's open up in a different tab. I believe it's just GitHub right now, just because that's what people have been asking for. Oh, all these open API questions, more.
Yeah, so this is we're about 42 minutes in. Joyce, did you want to keep going, or did you want to open for questions? I think I might have been taking you off on some tangents.
Yeah, but these are great tangents. I have 2 things I want to show you, and then we will, I think I'm going to scrap the advanced Postman stuff because I feel like people have questions and I want to talk about what you guys want to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and show you 2 things. I'm going to tab back over to collections. I'm going to close this up just to clean it up a scotch. So remember when we publish stuff? Oh, I think I published something to the API network, so I'm going to have to remember to unpublish it. Otherwise, somebody's going to get real confused. But when I go to this new button, and you can find this either in the web or Postman app, which I'm in the Windows Postman app right now. Remember I told you to go to templates and go to GraphQL to look for that if you wanted to poke around and follow along. The API network is right here. So if you have a public API, the canonical use case is I'm in Postman and I'm working and I'm like, oh, I want to build something that like loops up with like Twitter or like, you know, PayPal or something like that. This is how I can go ahead and pull it in and interact with it. And it's very timely. The two people I want to call out as really good documentation, actually Twitter and Imager both have fantastic documentation, but these teams I've been working with recently is Ping is an identity access management company. So they have a whole host of collections because they have different products, right? They have different APIs for different products. So this one in particular, they only have 6 imports, but we just finished. In fact, let's go ahead and view their documentation.
Yeah, let's.
It's opened in a separate window again. Okay, so let me expand this. Okay, so ping 1, blah, 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 IAM stuff. Here's a table about variables. They're adding this in Markdown. Here's a screenshot that explains their incredibly complicated tech. That's helpful. And if I go ahead and expand these folders, it's like, holy, there's so much here. But they're telling me exactly how to get started, right? And it's organized well. I don't mind that there's like a huge textbook here. This is gonna help me get stuff done. So Ping did a really good job. And then, oh yes, here's an interesting use case. So Dropbox, Dropbox is a file, modern works, you guys know Dropbox? Okay, so they have a really interesting collection. So Ping, we just looked at their API reference, right? They had 2 different management platform and something else, management APIs and authentication APIs. Dropbox, this is their published documentation. They've actually created documentation for admins. No admin is ever going to use those APIs to like build an app, but they're going to use the APIs to do something, right? So Dropbox can either build out these workflows in the Dropbox admin console in their UI, or these people have created these little workflows that link add member to the team, get groups, get more groups, get add member to the groups. So if you actually look here, let me pull this one into Postman. I'm pulling it into my Windows version. Okay, so this toast just came here. I imported this. Dropbox API workflows, just 17 requests, but you can load it up and immediately you can see, okay, this is what I need. And in fact, they've written scripts. So one thing that I hadn't talked about, but it is in the advanced Postman, is there's pre-request script and tests tabs where you can write JavaScript to set up what's being sent here and then test or tear down or chain information. So once I add a member to a team, I can go ahead and get group and make sure that that member is added to the team, right? So they've created these workflows that actually sophisticatedly chain from request to request to request to request, doing something for the admins. That's pretty neat.
Yeah.
Any questions?
So publishing documentation is, I assume, a paid feature, and are collections as well, or?
No. So the collections are like, you can call them folders or whatever. That's not a paid feature. Publishing documentation is not a paid feature either. I think it might be, if you want to host it on a custom domain, you would need to be on a plan. And then if you're getting more than like 10,000 views or something, it's rate limited. Yeah, so like if you have a small project or something on the side, you can go ahead and publish it. And the Run in Postman button is not paid at all. Like I wish more people would use it because it's a nifty little tool. And I get a tickle out of when people, when I see it on people's documentation. I've actually interviewed at companies where they're like, build something. And then I search through, not like now, because I'm very happy in my job, I'm not interviewing. But in the past, I've looked for the Postman the Run and Postman button so I can pull it in so that I don't have to go through the documentation and then copy and paste little bits and blurbs into Postman as I'm trying to get something working. Go ahead and ask your questions. I just remembered something else to Google. Okay. So Okta is another one. So here's that little run and Postman button.
Gotcha.
I think Twitter we saw in the API network, but they have ones where, like, I've seen one, oh, look, see, it's under REST. It's how you can do the REST calls.
So the API network is like a marketplace, like a catalog?
Yeah, you can call it any of those things. It's not a marketplace because it's not like you're paying. It depends on what you think marketplace is. But
a catalog,
you're
then,
not,
like a
yeah.
Browse around. Maybe I need this thing from Okta, or maybe this thing from
Yeah. Catalog's a good word. Let me go back to. Oh, there it is. Okay. So we talked about a lot of stuff, and I apologize. I do talk fast as well. So if I lost anybody, apologies. You can go back and watch the YouTube at like half the speed. We talked about a ton of stuff. I'm going to show you this advanced page. I'm not going to go through everything. We don't have enough time. But if anybody has questions about anything that piques their interest, feel free to ask me to go through it now or afterwards. If you want to, during chit chat time, we can talk about it. But this was kind of neat things that I'd seen other people do. Okay. It's all up here now. And I will share these. So these are the 4 companies that I said have good examples of documentation. Not that these are the 4 best, but it's top of mind. They did a good job. I grant them that. And I will leave you with one slide. Actually, I have 2 more slides. So I gave a talk like about a year ago, and this just came up in conversation recently, but I firmly believe it. If an API falls in a forest and no one is around to use it, is it still an API? So this brings up connotations of, if no one's using it, does it fulfill its purpose in life? And if I build an API, but I don't document it and nobody knows how to use it, is it done? Is it included in my definition of done? And that's why even though this is called Overview of Postman Documentation, I talked a lot about developer experience and what is it like for the user. So that's just a shower thought. And additional resources, if you want to dig down deep into all the stuff that is Postman, documentation, and a special plug for this, the Twitch, hopefully you can see my green thing again, twitch.tv/getpostman. We do live stream, and it's really lively, kind of like this with people chiming in through, except without your smiling faces. So check that out. And I know we're about to get to this in the meetup, but we are hiring as well. Postman is hiring. So lots of positions open in my group in particular.
Okay, cool. Maybe we want to open it for the questions that folks wanted to ask by voice.
I have one little question. Joyce, okay, so we looked at the Dropbox documentation as an example of what you thought was good. What we saw, is that the entirety of the Dropbox API documentation? Is that all they do? Is that Postman documentation?
Yeah, that's so what, Geraldine, when I said that that's good, it's kind of like it's an interesting use case. I hadn't seen that before. There's a couple use cases like that, but Dropbox has a public API. They have a rather good API. And they just started off with this because this was a hackathon idea. It was cross-functional. A bunch of people just hammered on it. And then this is what they came up with. But they actually have, like, if they don't have a regular API reference in here one day soon, I'll have to give them a call.
Okay.
With these companies that you pointed out, so they had to have come up with the specs to begin with, to even define what the API looks like. Correct?
So you used a couple words there. So specs, if they already have a API specification, then yes, they can go ahead and port that in. If they want to draft an API specification, theoretically, you can come here and do it in Postman. Some people don't use specs. Some people use collections for design. So when I'm here under the collections tab, I can create a blank folder. And if we're talking REST, because people like REST, go ahead and create all of your endpoints there.
Right. So my question though is, do you happen to know what they did, like Dropbox? Whether they had spec an OAS 3 or an OAS 2 spec file beforehand? I
only know this because I talked with the team over there, but they don't use OAS. They use an in-house specification format called Stone. It's written in Stone, but they're looking at moving. Actually, I don't know what I can say, so I'll just stop talking right there.
Okay, but they use they started with something like that, and then they did publishing through Postman.
Yes, they already had, in fact, the team that created that collection was not responsible for building out the API. I think it was some business people, some developer experience people, just different functions.
Interesting.
So some people will get started early on the design building part in Postman, and other people will use it for documentation after the fact.
Cool.
I'm wondering how much overhead is involved in bringing an existing API or set of APIs into shape that it can be accessed by Postman. I have I've convinced the people in my engineering group that they need to automate their API production. But they tell me it can't be done without a whole lot of engineering work that they never have time for. So could I turn something like this loose and automatically receive proper API documentation, or at least a framework in which I could fill it in?
And you're talking about automating the documentation, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so what you can do, here's the worst case that would happen. You create a new collection and you call it new collection, and then you basically, where did it go? Oh, it's right here. Let me start and bring it to the top. And then you're sitting here and adding requests manually. You're filling in the headers, the params, the body, all that stuff. That's the worst case scenario. You're starting from scratch and you're manually entering everything in. The next best scenario is you have something that ports into Postman. And we looked at those API specification formats on the APIs tab, but the import is supports a bunch of different file formats as well. If you have curl requests you can go ahead and paste in as raw text. So there's ways to more efficiently get stuff into Postman, but depending on your organization, I would ask people if they have a Postman collection, because what happens is a lot of people have their own working Postman collections. They just don't want to document it. They don't want to keep it up to date. They don't want to share it, not because they don't want to be nice, but because it's just their working documentation. A lot of people do have their own working collections.
William, these are REST APIs that you want to document?
Yes.
Has your engineering team actually tried to generate documentation out of their code before?
You know, it depends on which. It's a modular product. Some of the modules are to open API spec, and I've actually managed to get them to do it once. And it, we went gee whiz, and then they went back to their work. Other stuff, I'm assured, is very difficult, but they can't explain to me why. I mean, I figure they got machines to do this stuff nowadays, so why aren't we using them? But
yep.
I'm not technical enough to parse it down.
The answer doesn't surprise me. I'm just thinking that you always have to start, that sometimes there's a limit to what you can get out of people, and sometimes you have to start with just the absolute minimum and then fill the rest in yourself. Unfortunately, I had to do that, but my API is not big, so
I'm trying to get to the absolute minimum without any technical background. So.
I absolutely agree with you, and lack of not having a technical background makes it even worse, because you're at the mercy of engineers who will sometimes tell you stuff just because they'll tell you it's too difficult just because they don't want to do the work. So, but I won't get into that because, you know, we all know that one. So.
Yes.
So how many? We probably also have some engineers on the call. So.
Yeah, I'm a former software engineer. I can say that with impunity. There you go. As a member of that group, Clarence, were you starting to say something?
I was wondering how many endpoints need to be automated and are way too complicated to be possible. Is it like hundreds or dozens?
I would say dozens, probably. Maybe 100, but probably not that many.
Oh, fairly large number. A lot to do manually then. A lot to just not automate and keep up to date, right?
Yep.
Well, I figure once you've got the code updated, it's up to people who are updating the code to keep the code updated, you know, or at least, you know, it would be better than my having to chase it around. I mean, I don't even want to belabor you with the troubles that I've seen, but they are legion, and you know, reuse is nil. So if they reuse a module, then I have 3 books to chase. It's crazy, and it's driving me nuts. So any technological assistance I can get from a Postman or, you know, Swagger or anything, I would gladly deploy if I could just deploy it easily.
So, Joyce, I have a question. From the point of view of folks who are more on the documentation side, not that there's a wall, but when I worked on API documentation, you know, I generally wasn't in charge of, I mean, there were times when I was actually editing the spec, the OpenAPI spec file, but mostly I was receiving it and trying to make sense of it. And I'm wondering how, for that role, how I would use Postman. Like, I could import the spec, I could exercise the API to understand it, I could, I think if I'm understanding right, I could generate then request and response bodies. Am I on the right track?
Yes, so you're just thinking about like a maintainable state after you do the work, like how can you maintain this?
I'm thinking about this for folks who maybe are much more oriented towards the words rather than the code.
And trying to use Postman as a tool for learning how the endpoints work, right?
Thank you, yes.
Yeah, so if you're starting with a specification and you port it in, so one thing that I like about Postman, and not just because I work there, but because I get to interact with people that are using Postman, is that it makes it a little bit more accessible. So the OpenAPI schema, the specification format will describe to you request and response, but until you're actually interacting with it, a lot of people, their learning style is interaction and trial and error. All those paired requests and responses will be converted to Postman requests. Different examples. I didn't talk about mock servers, but mocks are the ability to kind of like hit a mock endpoint, in this case, hosted on Postman Cloud, and kind of experience that real server behavior. I'm not sure if this answers your question, but compared to an open API specification that is all about driving the design and development and governance of an API, once you bring it into Postman, you have the interaction, the interactivity.
All right, thank you. That's what I was getting at.
A question, if we have a moment. I'm trying to understand a little bit of discoverability in terms of this documentation solution. First off, I didn't notice any kind of search feature on the site or any of those collections. I poked through some of them. And I'm trying to figure out if I was to use this on my system. We've got a search that searches our doc portal. How would I be able to tie that in and be able to discover and find some of these APIs using that type of a feature? Any idea? Or has anybody done anything like that?
So there's a team feature that I didn't talk about today. So I talked about the API network, which is a public I think, Liz, you said catalog of public APIs. There's also a private API network, which is your API specifications and all the collections, documentations, tests, like whatever you have associated with those specs. That is a Postman team feature. So if you're part of a Postman team and you have your APIs housed there, that is like essentially serving as your dev portal or your discovery. There is searchability for public APIs so that you can search and find things. Some people will actually publish documentation, but not include it in the API network. Sometimes they'll publish the documentation and then just kind of point people to it. Some people will just use the Run and Postman button with nothing published. There's a lot of different adventures you could take, forks in the road. Does that answer your question related to discoverability though?
It pretty much does. I mean, it's not an ideal solution though. It sounds like it's just a bunch of ways to get there without actually finding what I'm looking for. So if I'm, trying to say, how do I add a user to my system, and I'm doing a search on that in our documentation portal, I wouldn't be in it. I want to add a user to my system using an API. I would not be able to actually hit a page that was documented in Postman. It sounds like.
It's dependent on the documentation, unfortunately. So unless the API is called add a user to the page or something like that, it's just going to be a search on the top level metadata of the collection.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure.
I don't want to interrupt chit chat time. I'm totally happy to field questions, but it sounds like you guys have a rousing like networking chit chat time too.
Well, we have some things we cover after the presentation. I just wanted to make sure before we move into that phase that we had covered people's questions. There were a lot of questions from folks who already use Postman. I'm wondering if there's questions by voice from anyone who's really new to it, or who's been saving up some questions from the very beginning that they're lacking context on.
I hope I didn't scare anyone. I like seeing everyone's cats walking across the screen too.
My cat's down there somewhere. Actually, Joyce, I think that when the comment about moving fast was probably not about your voice, by the way. It was about mousing. I think it was just like in the UI of Postman, like this is over here, this is over here.
Yeah, and, that makes sense.
You live and breathe it, but if you haven't seen it before, it might have been a little fast.
I have a giant cursor too, so I hope I didn't make anybody nauseated.
I don't think it shows up giant on the version that we see. I saw a green dot pointer. Anybody else got questions for Joyce before we move into the job networking part?
I just have a quick question, Liz, if I can.
Sure, Swapna, go ahead.
Joyce, so thanks for the presentation. It's really great because I use Postman for some of my API documentation. I was just wondering, Postman itself as a tool is sort of more, I guess, promoted towards developers, but when it comes to documentation, I guess it offers a lot of potential in terms of documenting straight out of specs and open APIs, and there's a lot of things technical writers themselves can do. So I'm just wondering, how is it, I'm just trying to understand what sort of promotions there are for technical writers when it comes to a tool like Postman, because there's still a lot of writers out there who do API documentation without getting into something like Postman.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what you mean by promotion, but I will say that Postman was created by a developer for developers right off the bat. But today we ask people what is your job function when they download Postman. And I think the second most populated answer is like none of these, like non-technical. I don't identify with any of that. So I would say that we're very cognizant that there's there's like functions that you've never even heard of interacting with APIs, like using Postman. And like a few years ago, we had our first user conference and we explicitly didn't call it a developer conference because it was like, nope, like 80%, like just, it's just, I'm not sure what you mean by promotion, but Postman as a company and Postman as a tool is very cognizant that it's not just developers using Postman. And in fact, I feel like a lot of people are using Postman. I don't think Postman's a low code, no code tool, because if you're writing scripts, you're writing JavaScript, but people think of it that way.
Do you see that in your work in DevRel then, Joyce, that like you end up talking to all kinds of audiences, not just developers? Like it's called developer relations, but in any given week of your work, you could be talking to all kinds of different roles.
Yeah, I just gave a talk like a few weeks ago that was like, at what point do we stop calling ourselves developer relations? Because we started off talking to developers, but now, and I still get to talk to developers, but like a lot of people think of Postman as a testing tool, right? So you might have just never heard of Postman for documentation and are only learning about it now. Documentation is actually one of our very, very popular features that we just put it out there and it just kind of took off. A lot of people think Postman's a testing tool because it has the word test in like a lot of the verbs there, you know, so.
Yeah,
like
when
testers.
I posted about this talk in my LinkedIn, one of the people who responded was a fellow I used to work with who's a QA tester.
Oh, for sure.
But that's what he uses Postman for, is his work in QA.
There's huge segments beyond developer.
Understood. Okay, well, we have time for maybe like a couple more questions. I know Joe had a bunch of questions. Likely suspects, Chuck, maybe B. Jessica's like smiling. She already knows Postman. Last chance for questions before we go into announcements and job networking.
I just want to say thank you. That was great.
Yeah. The fact that you guys are asking all these questions is like, I don't get to do that hardly as much anymore. So I love it. Thank you for keeping me up.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. So Alyssa, I think we can end the recording.